And we are back. This is RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. Dave Johnson is our next guest. Dave is a good friend of mine, but don't hold that against him. He is a senior fellow, as am I, at the Campaign for America's Future, although I'm upgrading to Jolly Good Fellow shortly. I haven't told you that, Dave. And also a senior fellow with Renew California, and he has just written an article on why it's expensive to be poor. I think he's going to follow up with why it's cruel to be kind and why it's hip to be square. But, Dave, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Richard. It's great to be here.
Well, listen, you do great work. I'm a big fan of your work. And I think you're too nice to the administration sometimes, but I'm a big fan of your work. And this is a great piece because, you know, look, as you point out, we actually have a situation where the Wall Street Journal called the poor lucky duckies during the Bush administration because they pay very little taxes. But first of all, leaving aside the fact that, of course, they pay a lot in taxes when you count sales taxes and payroll taxes and so on, the working poor or even the non-working poor, so it's incorrect. The notion that the poor are somehow lucky is part of this punitive attitude that people have towards the working or indigent poor. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about that. So what does it mean when you say it's expensive to be poor?
Well, first of all, Republicans talk about all the things people get, not just that they don't pay federal income taxes like, you know, at a very high rate, but they like to talk about cell phones a lot, and the other things they supposedly get. But the fact is, it does suck to be poor. It actually does. But the surprising thing here is that so many people are either in the poverty level or not far above the poverty level. Half of Americans qualify for that, and 76% are living what's called paycheck to paycheck, meaning that one car accident, one medical problem, and they fall into that trap of being poor. Poor is very expensive because all of a sudden all these things that we take for granted, if we have an income, if we have savings, go away, and all of a sudden things start to cost a lot. The big
give me an example. Give me an
Sure.
example of
Sure. Well, the first obvious example is transportation. If you don't have savings, a down payment, et cetera, you're stuck. You either have to try to get $350 to get a car that costs $350, which means it's going to last about a week, or, you know, until you have to get something major fixed. That's expensive, getting stuff fixed. They're gas hogs. That's expensive, getting to work when you're getting, 15 miles a gallon, okay? Transportation's expensive, and if you don't have a car, it's expensive not only in that municipal transit systems are, you know, in terrible shape, unfunded, et cetera. They've raised rates, but you can take a tremendous amount of time. It can cost you a lot in time to get to work. And if you have to have two jobs, you're not talking about a lot of sleep. And often you have to have two jobs if you're lucky enough to get a job when you're poor. Then there's the next thing, and this is largely invisible to policymakers, so this one's really important. And you wrote about this just the other day, is that if you're poor, you don't have and probably can't get a bank account. And even if you do have a bank account, if you're poor, you're going to be getting all these fees. You know, you don't have the minimum balance required, fees. You might bounce a check, fees. You not only bounce a check, but they set it up so that once you bounce a check, they set it up so that the large check comes first, and then they bounce all the small things you wrote or ATM after that. So very expensive.
I think, let me just jump in for a second, Dave. I think the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau put a stop to that. I'm not sure, but we can check.
Well, that's great, but you still you're paying $35 if you bounce a check.
You bet.
And if you're not making a lot of money, or if you don't have a job, that's an incredible amount of money. But beyond that, a lot of people don't even qualify for bank accounts. You wrote about this idea that the post office could be a source of a bank account for a lot of people, so they could just go in and cash their checks there and not have to rely on payday lenders. See, there's the next place that's expensive is if you don't have a bank account, then you're you're dependent on things like the check cashing services, the payday lenders, and all of those. And there's a place where it's immediately very expensive. What
Absolutely. And you mentioned another area which I really love to get into, where because I think this is really important and people don't realize it, which is eating.
Oh, yeah, yeah. See, first of all, you got to have a place to live, and you don't have first, last, and deposit, right?
Right.
You're living somewhere where you can get in with cash, etc. You're living in a week-to-week motel, etc. These are the kind of things that are so invisible to so many policymakers, too. If you're living in a week-to-week place, then that means you don't have a stove or a refrigerator, most likely, and you're dependent on fast food, okay, nearby. Transportation means you're nearby, okay, so the problems all start to add up the minute you fall into this. But not only that, even if you can buy groceries, you're not living in the best areas. Transportation's a problem. You're dependent on these kind of local corner stores, etc. Things are really expensive. So right away, you're paying more for almost everything that people who have savings stuff take for granted. You're paying
and I
more
want to
for all of
digress.
those too.